There we go. The same sparkling personality as David. He's out today, so I'm just standing in for him. Welcome, everyone. I will drop a link just to make sure that everyone's got today's. Thank you, Emily. This is today's document. And I believe that normally what we do is we find a note taker and then get started talking. So who's up for taking notes today?
I'll do it.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate it. And if you're in attendance, please add yourself in. And I'll just share my screen. I hope it's not too big for everyone. We'll start with the first RFC here, allow resource to report status, number 738.
Yeah, we're gonna present that one today.
Would you like me to let you share?
Sure.
Easier.
Yeah, that works.
There we go.
Let me just find everybody. Cool. Yeah, so basically this came from a request for RFC issue that was out. And the idea is just to allow templates to describe what health and I guess lack of health of a resource means for the given resource that the template is stamping out. And there's already been some comments on this and there's been some edits to the RFC, so I'm just going to present it as is, not the original version that had comments that were accepted. So the basic idea is for all template types to now include within the spec a place to reference a resource status rule ref. I think that's supposed to say, whoops. I think there's a one that has it correctly. I think they're all wrong, but it's supposed to be each template is able to reference a resource status rule, which is a new CRD we will define. And the CRD looks, actually I can scroll to the bottom to show the spec, but a resource status rule essentially looks like this. Has at the moment, two top level fields, healthy and unhealthy. And under each of them, you can define conditions and or fields where Cartographer can look to find the health of the resource. And so, for example, if you defined a condition, if we go back to the top for an example, you could say whenever this thing is ready true, that means it's healthy, or if it's ready false, that would mean it's unhealthy. So Cartographer would look for that to determine the health. Or if you had one that was defining fields, let's for a simpler one, you could just say like for a service, for example, that doesn't have any conditions. So you could say if the status.load balancer field has been filled in, then it's healthy. If not, then it's not healthy. And so this match fields section follows the way we've done match fields in blueprints, selecting templates that, the same operators in, not in, exist and does not exist. And if you say like in, then you just provide a values. And then for conditions, all you have to give is the type and status of the condition. And so this healthy or unhealthy status gets reflected in the workload status in the resources section. So for everything, for every resource, there'll be a new top level field right now named stamp status, although we do not like that name. We just couldn't think of a better one at the time. So that's up for discussion, but this new stamp status field for every resource, which will give the overall status, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. And then it'll either have fields or conditions. So this one was defining a match field. So it'll give you the fields that it read to determine that it was unhealthy. And so if you had a conditions one, then it would look like this. It would give you the condition that it read. And for condition, even though you've only supplied the type and status, we'll fill in everything else that was in the condition. It will propagate everything else that was in the condition. And for fields, we give you the option. This is an optional field to put in match fields. It's just message path, which is just a place where a cartographer can populate kind of some sort of useful error message because match fields like with conditions, you naturally will have a message, but for match fields, you won't obviously have an obvious message. So if there's some more useful context that you want to provide, you can give a message path, and Cartographer will pull off the message, like the way CAP gives you a useful error message. We'll just pull the status there. And for fields, we'll just report the key that we were reading and the value that led to the state. And then finally, if Cartographer cannot read healthy or unhealthy, like it can't read any, it can't successfully reconcile either the healthy conditions and fields or the unhealthy conditions and fields, it will say that the resource is in an unknown state. We have an example somewhere. Unknown, right? Like this one. So if you say that you're looking for ready true, and for some reason we're not at ready true yet, then and we're also not at ready false, there's just nothing there, the resource will go into the unknown state. So that's just in terms of the difference in what users will see. In terms of underlying behavior is another important point, or a couple of important points. First of all, just to reiterate, the three states that a resource can be in right now are healthy, unhealthy, and unknown. Healthy and unhealthy are up to the user or the template author to define. Unknown just means Cartographer cannot determine either one of those two states. And for all the healthy conditions, they will be ANDed together. So if the resource is only in a healthy state if every condition and field is met. But for the unhealthy state, if the conditions and fields are ORed, so if any condition or any field resolves successfully, then that would mean the resource will go into an unhealthy state. And finally, the templates will two things. First of all, templates will have a status now, and the template will only be considered ready if the reference cluster resource status rule exists, or if you don't reference rule because it is optional, which we'll get to. And otherwise it'll be false. And this way blueprints which reference the templates will know the blueprint themselves will not be considered ready unless all the templates are ready. And I mentioned that you don't have to reference rule. We've defined in this RFC that if no rule is referenced, every resource will just default to healthy, but that it can be debated. And the reason we chose that is because as part of this RFC, we've determined that, or we've defined that the owner, so the workload or deliverable will not go into a ready true state unless all underlying resources are currently healthy. And therefore, if the default behavior is not, or if the default behavior is that resources do not go into the healthy state if no cluster resource status rule is defined, then the owner will never go into the ready true state. So I said a lot. Any questions, anything I can clarify? Anything that wasn't clear?
I have a question about the cluster resource status rule. Is there a reason that's a separate CR versus embedding it in the thing? Is the reusability there? I'm trying to think, like, if you had a bunch of templates that templated the same underlying resource, maybe that's a reason to do reusability. But I was just curious behind if that's your motivation or something else.
Yeah, one of the alternatives we defined was that we could embed them directly in the template, but there's two reasons. One, like you said, if you have a bunch of templates that type of the same resource type, then you might be duplicating these rules, which is also theoretically more of a, well, yeah, that's one reason. And another thing is just like ready true might be a common condition that a lot of resources share. So even if they're not the same underlying resource type, there might be some set of conditions that hold true across multiple resources.
Trying to think if a direct reference is the right, like if you have a catalog of templates, right, that you're making available. Now those templates have this kind of external dependency on something else. Is that thing going to be distributed along with the templates? What if names conflict between that thing and, the same thing that other templates are bringing from the catalog, right? I don't have a better idea, right? For like, I don't think it makes sense to make it cluster local and then select against the templates, because then you get different, your template would have different behavior on different clusters. So that aspect of the direct reference I like, but sorry, Scott, go ahead.
I literally was just raising my hand as you apologized, so no need to apologize. So I also tend to agree that I would tend to lean towards inlining these rules. That they are at all complex is probably an indication that the rule itself can be simplified. Like for many cases, I expect it will just be as simple as basically just grab the ready condition and use that as an aggregate that represents everything else. And that's like all the rule needs to be. The other big advantage of not having external rules that we don't have to actually start reconciling all the template resources as well as the blueprints. And they can just continue to remain as is.
That's fair. Definitely open to moving them back. Well, our original idea was to move it in. So definitely open to moving them back in. I think makes a lot of sense to not want to reconcile all templates.
I think I had this idea earlier for like a way to extract and reuse the kind of like workload selection logic into the workload inspectors. It's like one of the kind of earlier architecture documents, and decided that, you know, it's really the distribution problem that makes it hard to externalize pieces kind of what's in those templates. And so, you know, because this has shown up a couple times, I wonder if there's, you know, maybe in this case we don't need to be able to extract this logic into something separate. But I wonder if in the long term we should think about patterns for, you know, if templates do need to share information, right? What would those patterns look like? Although in this case, I think it'd probably be okay to inline.
I wonder if when inlining, we should consider something like, by default, we like the templates evaluate like ready true, ready false. But then if you're then working with a resource that does not adhere to that, then you provide, because I would guess that like the majority probably uses the ready true meta v1 conventions, but then like one or another resource, you would then have to inline the definition because it's a little odd kind of resource.
So in that case, you would have to explicitly call out resources that don't follow that convention, as opposed to just defaulting to a resource that doesn't have a rule defined as just implicitly healthy. Because you don't know the difference between a resource that just hasn't reconciled and doesn't have a ready condition yet versus a resource that will never have a ready condition.
I wonder if this comes back to the, you know, we're talking about in some cases providing tools to make runtime contract changes, right, for like artifact tracing, but being really explicit about them. I think if we're going to assume ready true in order to do visualization or in order to like give users a better indication of what's happening, that seems reasonable. But if we're going to assume ready true to make, you know, runtime contract changes, then I feel like that needs to be more explicit, right? Don't have a solution there. I just thought it was interesting, you know, what you're going to use the data for, you know, determines whether how comfortable you are maybe making the default.
I'm hoping that's a segue into one of my concerns about this RFC, but I just want to check if anyone else has anything else they want to discuss before I take my shot. I really like this one. I do actually have a question before I talk about my concern. Did you guys derive this from somewhere? Because there's no prior art written on this, but I was wondering if you took inspiration from someplace or another on how these choices were, you know, the design of the CRD for matching.
Yeah, I think we really tried to just start from no prior art, and then we thought about, you know, options and how we added like the selectors there, and this felt kind of similar to that. And then upon like talking further with Zero on this, Zero showed us some really old prior art. And we were pretty close actually to what was originally designed.
I guess my question was more like, is there something in the public domain that already does something like this that we can draw upon just to,
The selectors
size
was
and
our
compare?
biggest sort of inspiration, I would say.
right? Okay.
I think in Argo workflows, because they support you submitting Kubernetes objects, you have a way of indicating success or failure, but still those are like, they're not like level triggered resources,
Right.
I think. I'm just trying to find real quick here.
I
Cap
mean, I'm just
controller
asking.
also has this. Cap controller also has this ability to tell it. It has default wait rules, but you can also define wait rules in a cap config that would tell it how to wait for a resource or how to know if something is successful or failed.
I mean, my only reason for bringing this up is that sometimes an idiom exists that we haven't taken the time to go and find. That's all. All right. Let's see if we match up with it. I like this design, but it feels, yeah, it feels first principles, which is often good. But I was just wondering if there was something else that already sort of reflected this thinking out there. I mean, I'm not too worried. I don't think we're going to like collide with other people's preconceived notions because there's not a lot of this, but that's why I brought it up.
Should we take a look at the cap weight rules and see if there's anything you should take inspiration from or
We did look at the
consider?
weight rules when doing this. I forget like our complete conclusion on that, Marty. We found them difficult to read, first of all, and they only deal with conditions, I believe, and they don't deal with match with fields.
Right, we did look at these and both those things are true. And also it seems very hard to reason about when you try to get, when you have multiple conditions, because you have to like visually kind of figure out failure, like aggregate all the failures and successes, I guess. I don't really, honestly don't fully know how they parse these, but yeah, it seemed hard, and especially when we wanted to add field matching and like to name it condition matchers when we already have match fields, match selector, all that terminology internal in Cartographer felt wrong. But yeah, we did see these.
Cool.
The one interesting thing I think about the wait rules is because there is the resource matcher, if there's a way to not need to mention within the template necessarily the wait status. If you had a resource matcher of what resources a specific rule creates, and then anyone that created templates, you don't necessarily need to add a ref to the wait rule because a tecton task always has the same status. So anyone that wants to add any resource into a supply chain or into a template could simply create these, and then there's no referencing that needs to happen. So if they don't exist, it just defaults to, we're not going to look for a status, but there's no built-in dependency on having those CRDs in a cluster. You get more visibility if you have them, but they're not hardly coupled that you need another resource in order for the template to be imported and work in the cluster.
I think part of what you're defining is one of the other alternatives we defined here, which is like the status rules can select templates themselves. And so like status rules would apply to any, would like define the kind, API version and kind of the resource that the status rule applies to. And any template that stamps out that API version and kind would automatically, get that resource rule. And we decided against that because with YCT and even in regular templating, as Scott pointed out, the API version and kind of the resource being stamped out can be templated as well. And so it'd be very hard to know just by looking at the template what rule will be applied. So that's why we steered away from that, but definitely was something we considered and still theoretically open to, I guess.
The other big drawbacks there are if you're looking up these resources dynamically by name, then you can only have one, sort of by definition. So that if you ever have resources that have really complex status and people might have different perspectives on what it means to be ready or what it means to be healthy, then tough, you get one. The other issue is because it's the cluster script resource, like they can only be defined once in the cluster. So that if you have, especially if you're using CAP, if you have multiple apps trying to define the same resource, then it's basically the first claim wins and everything else will just bounce off later. So if you have like two different packages that are trying to template a new resource for the first time, they both define this resource, they'll end up colliding.
Makes sense. Zach?
I have a comment on a slightly different topic, so if anyone wants to keep on the current one.
Still related to this RFC?
Yes, absolutely. Cool. So there's this question of like healthy and unhealthy. And I sort of wonder, like, is there any value in, it's almost like what we're doing here is something that could be sort of generalized, right? Like aggregate statuses to a thing, right? Would there be value in saying that like we let template author and supply chain author pick the status, and further we make it so that it's not just this one special thing, it's just something you can do. You can aggregate data off of your underlying resource into you know, more than one of these types of sort of summary values.
That's
We
kind
had
of where
considered
sorry.
that, allowing template authors to determine it's an array of statuses and they can call the status whatever they want. And if we can determine, you know, a status to be successful or meet all the criteria, then we could promote that state of whatever, you know, they want to call it. It gets a little bit more complicated with the ands and the ors and deciding, you know, how you want to determine what makes that status or that state fulfilled. And there's no limits across, like we've talked about many times that like template authors may be different people. And so the states might not be the same across templates. And so we were trying to like come up with a framework for it.
Right, like the first one could say succeeded, the next one could say healthy, the next one could say green, the next one could say go. Like, no way, it would be very hard to reason about when you're looking at your resources if all your templates had different types defined. Not to mention, like, we couldn't do anything from the workload perspective of like holding workload ready true until everything's healthy, because that wouldn't be a state that exists.
The thing I actually wanted to discuss was I've been working on the information architecture view of a workload. Can I share screen real quick, Marty? Because this leads into the one that I actually wanted to ask, which was, imagine we're inside a workload here. Sorry, this is just a snippet of information, but I was thinking that in a workload under resources where we list them, it might be a builder or something like that, that the status of a stamped, this I think you currently call stamped status. My thought there was that maybe it could just be called stamped. But whatever it is,
responded to that. We already
Okay.
have stamped ref that as a top level condition, so I don't think stamped ref and stamped should be two separate top level fields, but
fair. No, that's fair. I mean,
would love a different word than stamp status.
it's a fair thing that there's what it's called, but what I figured, looking at this from a person viewing the workload with a lot of denormalized information about the entire system, and that's what we're trying to do here, is help people understand what the state of the system is via the workload, that we probably want an overarching condition like ready. We probably should reference for each resource. This is, we should probably reference whether the submission step has worked or not. There's a lot of events there that will be generating, but there's also information that should be there. And I'd like to also be able to reference whatever the status is that came out of this particular RFC, which led me to just ask, like, is there a way that we could make this more idiomatic? Because a status is usually true, false, and unknown when it's in a condition. I know this is outside of that, but the healthy, unhealthy also doesn't feel entirely idiomatic. I was wondering if it could be a top level for the stamp status conditions, those, you know, one kind that goes in there that represents idiomatically and as a condition the result that you saw from all the other fields, or if you've thought about that. I don't know if I explained that clearly enough.
If you're, I guess, first of all, I think the top level conditions there like would be valuable in terms of just aggregating like information that we have that we don't currently present to users in the most helpful way. But
Like this one.
yeah, but
Yeah,
that's like seems pretty separate from this RFC. I think
Right.
like line 14, having a status be true, false, or unknown doesn't really make sense, right? In a condition, the status of the condition type is true or false. Like ready is false, not status is false, right? And so you can't say status, like saying
No,
status is
I do understand what you're saying. I guess what I'm thinking is if I was to implement this, this would be the stamp conditions or stamp status or whatever we want, which literally references this. And then I need a value here. We'd have to do a translation at this point. We'd go healthy equals true, unhealthy equals false, unknown equals unknown. Just, I know it's a bit forward thinking and it's not just within the scope of this spec, but I'm jumping in early so that we could come up with something that looks like a list of conditions. Scott, you've got your hand up too, so I don't want to hold you up for too long.
we can change it to a type and a status, like type healthy, status true.
That might just help make it, yeah, more one-to-one.
I originally raised my hand to respond to something Zach said earlier, but Rash, the comments you're making here are almost a one-to-one comment I put on the RFC this morning.
Okay.
So I totally agree. The main thing I don't like about the stamp status today is that depending on whether you defined match conditions or match fields on your rule, basically the structure that shows up under stamp status is different. So I'd really like to see some way to actually unify so that there's like one outward facing consistent user experience in terms of how this information gets displayed. So a straw man I put up as a way to do that was basically just eliminate stamp status and replace it with basically resource conditions, what Rosh was just showing. And one of those conditions could be healthy. And then the message inside of that condition and the reason of that condition can then have that more richer detail. But that's a straw man proposal, although it definitely aligns with what we were just discussing.
Yeah, I guess I'm just hoping that we can come up with apparently I can't work out how to put my hand down at the moment, so I apologize for that. Not a very good meeting
And reactions.
host. Yeah, because I can't find it anymore for some reason. So I did find it to put my hand up, but now I can't take it down. Anyway, that's why I had to come from this external view of what the RFC is trying to deliver. In terms of what we present to users, I definitely want that. I wasn't going to be mean, Scott, because my concern is that there's multiple matches that could happen. And we've had this problem before. Like, it's quite noticeable here in a workload. You see the resources submitted status. We only show the first of possibly multiple failing ones. So that one-to-many mapping into a condition hides information. And I was glad that we finally had per resources space that we could put that, so we could have one for each place that it failed. And now we've got that same issue again for the status. It could be sourced from multiple fields. Now, how do we represent that? Again, in a single condition, which doesn't let you use structured data for a message or add an extra field that might help people. So I don't know if
Yeah,
what I was saying there made
definitely.
sense.
Part of that would be defining how those things get aggregated. And in general, I would expect most rules to be based off of like a single value or a single message. And like cases where there's multiples are going to be rarer. So like maybe you just concatenate the two together. Maybe you define like a little prefix before the string. Like, there are ways to do it. Like you have, I mean, messages are intentionally very long and freeform, so you can kind of do whatever you need to do. But putting some structure around it would be nice. But avoiding the need for that would be even better.
Is there a way to avoid the need for that? I thought that what Marty and Emily came up with is factually necessary for some scenarios that we need to match on multiple fields.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be cases where you will need to match multiple conditions or multiple fields. So like that still needs to exist. It's just a matter of how do you aggregate the message when that happens. I think that's places where we have room and flexibility. But in many cases, I think there will be a single resource or a single field producing a message that we actually care about.
All right, are we at a position where we can take some of that offline so we can just check on a couple of other RFCs? Has anyone got anything they want to continue with on this one? I'll take silence as assent. So next up is simplify runnable usage. This was discussed last week. I just wanted to see if anyone wanted to discuss anything further from this. No one else has added anything to the board, so I just brought forward what was up last week. This is simplify runnable usage. This is the one with Washuma that Washuma introduced for the using runnable inline. And I've seen a lot of discussion that's gone on in here. I don't know if anyone wanted to talk about this. Unfortunately, Washuma is not present. So it may not be terribly helpful, but was there anything that anyone wanted to mention on this today? Again, I'll take silence as assent. Or dissent. I can't even work out my negatives now. Next one is workload conventions.
So this one entered final call last week. So I guess it's now final call.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, it really is. Last week it was not shown as being in final call. So I'm going to put that. What's the correct term for final call here? Final comment period.
FCP.
So anyone object to this now becoming accepted?
Was it a 7-day period or a 10-day period?
I
have a feeling it was 10, but I don't.
I thought it was 7.
I thought it was 7.
It's 7.
If it's 7, then no one objected, so I guess it's done.
Great, accepted. Look at that process working. Thank you, Marty. So now we do actually have a little bit of time, space for show and tell, if anyone cares to. Does anyone want to talk about anything they've been doing this week that might be useful?
There's this discussion point.
Oh, sorry, that's true. I forgot about that one. I put it there myself and I forgot about it. Thank you. Co-hosting, that's why we pair. Should we add work to scrub possible secrets and sensitive information in our logging? This is a difficult thing. It will slow the system down if we start to scrub secrets, but we do log a lot of information. Usually information that we pull from error messages, but I think there's a risk for there to be secrets in some spaces. Does anyone have any thoughts about what we should be doing around this at this point? Knowledge about existing conventions?
What's the context you think a secret would show up in?
We often log errors that were raised by internal tools. So we do wraps, %W all the way down. So I can only guess that, especially when we try to apply a template, if something mentioned the content of the template or the partially applied API call, that there'd be information about the resource. Or there's certainly not been any alternative to this, which would be make sure when you're logging errors that they can't possibly be errors that would be raising sensitive information. I guess that could be the other way you could resolve this, but yeah, I haven't seen us try.
There shouldn't be places where we're putting secrets into the API server outside of a secret resource, right? And so, if we're logging, things that are coming from, etcd, we should be careful not to log the contents of, capital S secrets, right? Is it maybe you're worried about when we read those values and then pass them to Go libraries, for example, that we don't, where we can't necessarily control their error output, and then we surface their error output back up to the controller logs. You're worried about, essentially bugs in those libraries where, even though ideally they're contextually aware that we're passing them a secret, right? We're not embedding the password in the in a URI, ideally, right?
We use unstructured data a lot too. And if an API call fails and just decides to dump the JSON that failed or something like that, it wouldn't be structurally aware of that sort of information. All right.
I think I'm trying to get to what I'm trying to get to is, do you have examples of places where we could log a secret and it wouldn't be a bug? Where, for example, we're passing secrets to a library in a way where that library is not contextually aware that it's a secret, and then it may log that information back out. Are there, or is the risk we're talking about purely, there could be bugs in those libraries where they, or we could be running them in a debug mode where they're known to output secrets, things like that, right?
I mean, it's possible that also, first of all, there's the word secret, which tends to glom around things that are specifically known to be information you don't want shared. And then there's sensitive information, which is just information that people don't necessarily want to have turning up in their logs about what is currently happening at a particular place. I haven't thought deeply about this. I just recognize that we haven't done any analysis of security here. When it comes to those secrets, I was concerned that you can't, it's a user error to inject secrets into your config, I guess. That would then be a config string that's in a resource. But if the config string that you're picking up and then applying somewhere else, that's untyped information. It's not obvious that it contains a secret or that it's a config map. It's just a long string of YAML. And you could easily have a problem when you go to hit an API server and it says, oh, it failed because there was a syntax error in this string. And here's one of them. Here's the string. Oh, that just happens to have secrets because someone put that in the config map. This is imagination, not concrete examples. This is what I was concerned about being possible. Again, we work with a lot of untyped data, or not strongly typed. The config comes back as a string. We validate that it's a valid YAML string, but that can easily be something that's still problematic. The first thing to do is security assessment. I don't know.
Do we have any use cases where a secret would be stamped out by a cartographer?
Anywhere that a user decided to do that.
I know they could, but is there like, is that?
Do we have
I
any
feel like
examples of
on the
users who
stranger
might
side of
try
a
to do
resource
that
to do?
deliberately? Right. I see what you mean. Use cases where users of Cartographer are likely to do that kind of thing. Not that I know of. Zero, maybe even Scott Rosenberg could consider, might have more real world.
I can't think of any use cases that I've seen around someone stamping out a secret in Cartographer.
Yeah, the
Use
only
case
case
for
that I
that.
can think. Sorry. I was gonna say the only use case I can think of is a secret that's like a placeholder that's gonna take some data later on. Like how with secret gen, you can have like those placeholder secrets for getting like registry credentials that I could think of. Or something cert manager related to. But then again, in that case, like there's no data there. It's, well, there is until there isn't. I mean, there isn't until there is.
But then cartographer would be trying to perpetually remove the data that gets
Yeah.
injected unless it's. But I wonder if it's even just worth saying that secret is the one resource that cartographer will refuse to stamp. Just say that cartographer is not a tool for secret management.
I think the one other use case there may be a secret is if someone's resource was an app, a CAP app, or anything like that, and to pass in values, you do a secret ref. So they may be stamping out a secret in order to add in values. It's not really a secret. It is and it isn't, and it's a data values file, but you know, they're using secrets.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's like no support for config maps, right? For the controller app for passing the values.
I think that may have been added. I think that was added in 032 of Cap Controller. There is no like config map ref, I think also, if I remember correctly, but still all the examples out there are secret ref in Cap Controller. And that's kind of become a de facto standard in that tooling, for good or for bad. You technically can do inline as well for values in an app CR. So you don't need to do secrets to do an app CR, but that becomes practice.
Yeah, so to kind of circle back to the original question, I think there's a distinction between like, are we going to accidentally log or leak information about resources that cartographer is interacting with, as opposed to there are secrets that cartographer has, primarily the service account that it's operating under and the service account that it's creating API requests for. I'm not super concerned about user resources because again, like stamping out a secret's kind of weird, and stamping out credentials onto a resource that's not a secret is also like an anti-pattern, but like it's that resource's problem at that point because they're the one violating the norms. But in terms of cartographer's own secrets, like I think like those are things that should definitely never be logged. At least the content of the secret should never be logged.
So there could be an action item to make sure that where we interact with those secrets, we're not in a situation where we might hit an error that can surface it. It's really all I'm thinking of when I talk about logging, right? We don't tend to log values specifically. We tend to say, well, here's an error from an API or a third-party library. So it might be worth to take that as an action item.
Yeah, on that front, I would rely on those APIs not leaking secrets themselves.
Right. And then there's the, so I mean, I guess really all I was wondering was, would people have, is it a reasonable expectation that we would always scrub logs before we emit them? All right. I'm not sure that that's true, but I just wanted to ask the question.
Like in many cases, you won't know what values are even sensitive to be scrubbed. So you kind of sunk before you start.
Yeah, a lot of the tools out there do things that look for secret like values and smash redact. And that's why I said it's expensive, right? It's a slow process. It definitely would slow down our realizer.
Concourse implemented this. This kind of, maybe that's one place where you're thinking of it kind of in a similar system if you squint, right? It's like it had a thing that would look for secrets in log output and then redact them automatically in the log output.
Yeah.
So you don't, because those concourse instances are often used by open source projects. The output is public, and you're might have a lot of different tasks, and like that extra level on top was useful. I think Concourse did that because of the use cases people had for Concourse that drove that to be a problem, right? I don't know if it's a common enough pattern in a Kubernetes controller that's more where the controller logs are more around something an internal operator would look at, and that it's not kind of made public and external, right? That it justifies, that same kind of solution to the problem, at least at this point, would be my gut.
Right. It's been sitting as a backlog item for me to bring up from a retro for a long time, and I thought I'd bring it here where folks could tell us if they saw any real red flags.
I'd say
Great.
probably no on proactive scrubbing, at least for now. But
That's
definitely
good.
good to be careful about it. For
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's pretty much all of the items here. There is a draft for events, but it is a draft, so I'm going to take it out of there, and I will present it next week when I've got it finished. And I might even save my show and tell for our next team meeting. So I think that's it for everyone. No one's got anything else they'd like to raise. I'd like to thank Emily for taking the notes. And thank you all for turning up. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.